It was only the Communist Manifesto. That's very easy. It's a very good read. It is an absolute delight to see you all here. It's incredible. I was saying I'm really pleased to be doing this because when I entered academia, as you will see, well, there wasn't really this encounter at all. There was nobody to legitimate me. The male Marxists at the time were very pure and terrifying, and I was always, "You're wrong," which haunts me to this day. And there were very few feminists. We couldn't find a feminist to either supervise or examine my PhD. So it's really good to see you all here. You can imagine how times have changed. And that to me is like a really big political win. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Sami and Suvi and Evelina for organising all this and bringing me here. And I'm delighted to be back in Finland, where I really like to be. I'm going to do a very quick history almost of how I put Marxism and feminism together, because I had to, because there was nobody else who was really doing it in the way I wanted to do it. So you'll see, it's almost a study in methodology and politics, because it's about how you put things together and where you take things from. Now, I am in no way a purist of any kind, as you will recognise. I take what works for me. I take what enables me to explain things, and sometimes I get it wrong. But I like to experiment with ideas. I like thinking about what works. And I love doing ethnography and empirical research to kind of try things out. So there is an archive, and I'm going to put the lectures on the archive. It'll probably take 2 weeks to make them accessible, as in accessibility. So don't worry about notes. They will be there, because I'm going to go through quite a lot very quickly, as I usually do, and drive people crazy. So it is Marxist Encounters or Feminist Encounters. And it begins early on. I use theories to explain. I'm not going to read all the slides out, only the ones that I think might be important. The other ones will have things on them. I hate fashions in theories, but it kills me nearly because I have to know what they're saying. So I will read a lot of Foucault, a huge amount of Foucault. I will read Deleuze. I will sit and struggle with bodies without organs for a year, I think. As an undergraduate, I did read the domestic labour debate and Grundrisse, trying to make sense of it, but I'm not sure I did. So, I need to know what's going on. I had FOMO before it was a thing. But I think we need to dwell with the originals often, and we need to really think about what they are trying to say. But I also think, and you'll see why I think this, it's about the context. We generate political ideas and theoretical ideas from our context, and that's why I did the book that was introduced by Anu yesterday, called Feminist Cultural Theory, because I was asking the different feminists around me to explain why they used, I think it was, all sorts of people actually, really, really different theories to explain their issues. So I'm always into that. And the thing at the end, reading groups are amazing. I just think kind of little ways of building solidarity, discussing ideas are the best things ever. So this is very, very quick. This is just how I got into it. Growing up in the north of England, long history of stroppy working class women. Trade unions were very, very important in my life, but then they disappeared. I went to a further education college, was going to be a nursery nurse, but then I kind of read lots more sociology and actually got told I should really do sociology. I wasn't suited for it, so I wasn't going to be a good nursery nurse. Don't trust me with the children. And then I got into a really posh university. Again, was almost speechless for a year. But it was a time when there were lots of Marxist courses. There are very, very few now. We had to put one on. And so I did everything I possibly could. And at that time, the domestic labour debate had just begun in the New Left Review, and Althusser had been translated. And I just spent hours. I remember spending 3 hours trying to read the first page of Althusser, trying to understand ideological state apparatuses. But I think it paid off. And I'm haunted by him, even though he, kills his wife and dodgy Catholic and all this, but he has got some very good ideas. So what I want to say, that for me, political struggle was as important as academia, and you'll understand why. I entered the world of thinking with very powerful trade unions in Britain, no longer, and very powerful women. Asian women were really, really fronting the trade union strikes. A very famous Grunwick strike in 1976, the Kewell Brothers strike in a factory in Smethwick. And what we had at the time was a lot of solidarity, bizarrely. You don't get a sense of that anymore because the laws have been instituted to make sure you don't get that sense. I also was reading around politically. It took me a while to find Claudia Jones, very famous communist in Britain who'd been banned from the US. And I wanted to be Angela Davis. I saw her and it was love at first sight, as you'll see as it goes through. And she had, by that time, written Women, Race and Class, and there was nothing like it. You know, for me, it was the first Marxist feminism. And she was being supervised by Mark Hooser at the time, so it was amazing. At the same time as this, we had all the women's liberation was happening, which to me at the time felt very different. It was happening in Oxford. It was very posh women. I've met them all now and they're not, but they seem to be at the time. They're all still wonderful. They're all still writing amazing stuff. Then Seikkula, Henry Wainwright and Sheila Rowbotham. But there's a lot going on in terms of feminism, a hell of a lot. Challenges to the Abortion Act, contraceptive pill was a big fight coming into that. The English Collective of Prostitutes, you know, we were really being challenged on every front in terms of different sorts of feminism, and all the things like rape crisis, domestic violence units were being set up, and obviously the history that I had to find out about. So when I enter university, there are kind of really emergent women's studies departments. There were 4 of them, all run by one person. That was it. One person did women's studies, and she had to cover the whole university. As you can imagine, they all got burnt out and became very ill. So there's a long history in that one. But there were lots of divisions within feminism, and you probably know these. Numbers 2, 3 and 4 were the important ones for me, and the debates were over concepts, patriarchy, family and ideology. Those were the kind of where the debates lay. And then Feminist Review was set up, which was amazing. When I was a little girl, I used to look forward to Jackie the comic, and when I was grown up, I looked forward to Feminist Reviews. Kind of that says something. But really important stuff. And there was a woman called Terry Lavelle that's often written out of history, but she did a brilliant book called Pictures of Reality about film and images. A really, really good book. And she was, again, my complete heroine. What was really significant, if you're looking at the debates, they're nearly all about the state. And we also have a different tradition. Now, this is very different to the UK Marxisms at the time, and forgive me for caricaturing, but this is the world I entered, and that's the way I'm going to depict it. There were 3 different trends. The 2 extreme ones were the most powerful, and they fought. Boy, did they fight. If you see these public school boys in a room go, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong to each other, you really are terrified. And they did that. You can see them. You can watch. I think you can watch videos of them still. So there was Perry Anderson, Tom Nem, and Bob Jessup, who were always right. And they never. I know I have this problem. They never stopped speaking. You couldn't get them off the platform. People would try to do all sorts, with them to get them off. Versus, so I'm leaving Stuart Hall out at this time, E.P. Thompson. He was also I am right, and he was right because he'd done the history. He wasn't just making it up, as he said to the others. And then Althusser wrote a book called, E.P. Thompson wrote a book called The Poverty of Theory. That was hard, which really attacked Althusser. So these divisions were, hard. And as a PhD student, you were expected to take sides. Well, I loved them, but I loved both sides. I couldn't be part of both sides. I was excluded and marginalised. But I loved E.P. Thompson, the work of, really proper history, went back into the archives, really talked about ways of life and struggle, really important. The working class made themselves in the conditions not of their own choosing. against, but I also love the logics and laws of capital. And, you know, to me, the ideological state apparati of Althusser were always incredibly important, as were most of his concepts about how ideology recognition works. So I'm trying to make sense of it, and then along comes Stuart Hall, who starts having more of a presence. Now that is real. That guy is off the stratosphere. He is so smart. I mean, he writes on everything. He's completely engaged. He understands. His first, bizarrely, his PhD was on hippies. Not many people know that. But he actually looked at how political change was occurring. And he learned a lot from Harold Walpy, who was one of Nelson Mandela's legal team. Harold Walpy, again, is brilliant work on South Africa. So there's all this going on, and Stuart Hall moves to CCCS Birmingham and sets up all these different groups. They're student-led groups by PhD students, and they're amazing. And they all go in different directions, which for somebody who needs to know what's going on is hell. And I wasn't at Birmingham, I was up the road doing the PhD, so I had to drive down all the time and trying to work out which theories work. So there was a lot happening, and it was vicious. Now, this is just a list of the thriving left. You can see there's a huge amount happening from the late 70s into the 80s. And it felt as if the world would change. We all thought, this is how hilarious it is, we all thought the world was changing and we were fighting about how to change it. You know, did you include gender or do you include gender after the revolution? You know, that kind of debate. What are you going to do with the welfare state? It's a repressive apparatus. And I was saying, oh God, I'd love the welfare state back in any form. I'd be grateful for a welfare state. So, you know, we thought things were happening. And even things like the Face magazine was political. These are some of the books that were very significant in terms of feminism, and I'm sorry it's a very messy slide, but Veronica Beachy worked on work, theories of work much more than the kind of ethnographies of work. Michelle Barrett became the real key white feminist and was subject to a lot of critique because of her lack of anti-racism, which felt very sad. So it's like, finally, we have somebody doing these debates, and then they get attacked. So it was a very difficult time to speak out. Very, very difficult time, I'd say. And then we get the debates about, is there a marriage between Marxism and feminism? And most people basically say, well, maybe. But, you know, we have to think about how we do it. Now, what really happens at this time is essentialism is challenged, biology is challenged, nature is challenged, the psychoanalytic. So, I mean, Sarah will do a very sophisticated paper tomorrow on people like Julian Mitchell and the history of the kind of influence of psychoanalysis as well into these debates. And ideology became really important. But interestingly, in feminism, it was often the family ideology, and it was stuck at that. It wasn't Althusserian ideology about how the motor of social change or not, and the significance of the state. So you've seen that. A lot of the debate around domestic labour at the time was, well, remember, working class women always worked. So they're not just gendered through domestic labour. And I keep putting stars on the books that kind of lit me up. So, and she's still absolutely amazing. And so I started a PhD, which became Formations of Class and Gender, and I wanted to put together ethnography and theory. There were certain books that I almost copied as a model, and one was Paul Willis's Learning to Labour. I don't know if people know it. Absolutely fantastic, but what you get is this kind of quite hardcore Marxist theory and then the speech of the boys that he's working with. But what it did, it was the most amazing analysis of masculinity. And he didn't say it's like gender and class, but he did look at how masculinity made the young working class men go into working class jobs because they wanted to be hard. They didn't want to be clever. They wanted to be hard and show how manual labour was significant for them. So it was a really good analysis of gender at that time. And then I was definitely drawn to culture, which didn't really fit in either way, because although E.P. Thompson's looking at history, he's not really looking at representations as such, because they weren't around in the same way. And so I thought, there's all these great models of media, how people understand the media. And there was David Morley's study of news, how people responded to the news. And I thought that would work, because I grew up with a father who was always shouting at the news, a bit like the Marxists, you know. That's wrong, they can't add up, that graph doesn't make sense. Me and my mum trying to get him out of the room so we could watch something on Hollywood. So I grew up with that kind of, there is something in the media that needs to be challenged. But also, there were some really good books that came out at the time, which were Altazeri and Judith Williamson. So this is like the background. There was also a journal that was as good as, or better even, than Feminist Review, called History Workshop Journal. And if you ever need, because the thing about history is you can keep going back to it. If you ever need any good references, I would go back to History Workshop Journal. Really, really good. And then there were the beginning of people coming and doing PhDs on women and work in factories. But of course, I didn't want to go and work in a factory. I'd gone to university precisely to avoid that, where half my school chums were. So I was not going to go and work in a factory as a PhD. I was going to do something different. And so I thought, well, where will I do it? Now, these are when I start speeding up a lot, because at the time, Thatcherism begins, and it starts to take effect. And I think we're all in shock. I actually think we cannot believe what is happening, because a bit like the really corrupt Conservative government that we've just had, which we couldn't believe, you know, use COVID as an excuse to give money to all your friends and yourself and your party. And so we're all kind of like rabbits in a headlight going, what's going on here? And there's so many fronts to fight on. You know, what do you tackle? The destruction of the welfare state, the destruction of trade unions, the racism for immigrants who were coming into the country at the time, all the new laws around homosexuality. I mean, where do you fight? What do you do? And we're all in a bit of a dither. Stuart Hall wrote a book called Thatcherism, which got absolutely trashed by the Marxists because they said he didn't understand ideology, which, bloody hell, I mean, come on. But it's an attempt to try and come to terms with what is actually happening around us. And what is happening around us is this. Thatcher, and this is significant for now, Thatcher begins to develop really strong relationships with the state. The state becomes militarised. Welfare's cut, the police are armed, becomes really significant. The next significant relationship, the media. She becomes best friends with Murdoch, and it's still going on, and Succession, of course, is the best representation of that family in the present. They've got bigger, they've expanded, they've got more power, and he takes over all the popular press, the Sun, the Express, the Mail. I mean, it's just unbelievable, and he destroys all the unions. Stuart Hall, remember, hero, he gets a star. He is still writing really important stuff, and it's called, the most important book at this time is called Policing the Crisis, which he wrote before, just as Thatcher came into power. But it's looking at the use of state violence against young black boys. So the key thing was, one in the Sun, a Murdoch paper, 1 in 4 muggers are black, with great, you know, kind of stereotypical pictures of young black boys. And actually that means 3 in 4, this would be my dad speaking, 3 in 4 are white. But it's all about the black connection. So it's a semiotic connection. Blackmail, mugging, and it gets tied together, and it gets repeated so often it becomes a significant ideology. And that feeds into the analysis of black masculinity as well. So surprisingly, riots. We have race riots across Britain against the treatment of black people by the police, which is horrific. 1 in 4 young black, no, 3 in 4 young black men have been criminalised before the age of 24 through what's called the SUS law, you know, stop and suspicion, the suspicion law. absolutely awful. More militarisation, more paramilitaries introduced. So I'm thinking, how do I make sense of all this going on around me? Because the world is changing. It's not just about family ideology anymore. It's about the violence of the state and what it's doing to lots of other people rather than just women. So I think, right, I'm going to do a study in education, but it feels a bit different to what's happening outside. And so I'm moving all the time between these different instances. The key theorist, I went back to look at my PhD, the key theorist I used was actually Gramsci in the end, because it was all about giving consent to power. So my big question becomes, and it's odd when you think about all the riots that are going on in the country, how do people give consent to power, or how do they challenge power? So we've gone from thinking about how do we change the world, oh, you know, we should do it this way or that way, into, oh my God, what we're going to do. And how do we do it? And how do we understand this? So I then rely on people like Stuart Hall and Harold Wolpe, who've been through, Harold Wolpe was part of South Africa, and, you know, total apartheid and brutalisation, killing of people, etc. And race becomes one of the most significant perspectives for understanding what's going on. It kind of informs everything that's happening, but then of course there's loads of debates between academics. If you're a white person, can you study black people, or even Irish people at the time? You had to be Irish to study Irish, so it, you know, kind of quite violent debates in the academy. I remember sitting on the 8th floor as it was wobbling in the wind in Birmingham, and people go, you can't do research on that, you can't do, and I was thinking, where are we going with all this? And it felt really, really sad. You know, the world's burning around us and we're being told we can't do research on this or that. But then you kind of stick with it. So one of the questions I was interested in at the beginning was, in all this tumult, how are people getting value when they're all completely denigrated? So we were getting lots of analyses of structure, of how people were being done to, subject to, how are they responding to it? And at the time, it's got a star, another great book came out, and these were my colleagues eventually, who were wonderful, love them, and they were part, well, two of them were part of the CCCS queer reading group at Birmingham, and they wrote Off Centre, and they did lots of analysis of the kind of stealthy laws that have been introduced around women's bodies. They challenged all the Deleuzian theories on reading bodies as texts, and they really went for kind of almost historical models and looked at how culture is lived. So it's a kind of, again, they were moving between Stuart Hall, E.P. Thompson, I'd say. And so we get the significance of race and class, and you can see Hazel Carby, very important for an article, White Woman Listen. Kind of is a wake-up call to all of us who didn't understand or know about colonialism because we haven't been taught it at school. And then went, oh my God. Lots of interventions by Sinn Féin, providing educational materials. So we started to understand Irish imperialism. And then we were getting loads of very good material coming from feminists, from the Margarita von Trotta, you may know, from the Baader-Meinhof group. And as this is all going on around us, but still we haven't got any engagement with male Marxists at all, but we are engaging through race and class, and often being told we had to do something. So instead of us thinking what we're going to do to change the world, it was like, right, you have to go out and do anti-racist education. I ended up, it was hilarious, did I put this in? I ended up teaching anti-racism in Long Lartin prison, where they had actually put the supposed Birmingham bombers, who were, you know, the key leaders in Sinn Féin, who knew more about racism than I ever would. So it's like the bizarre contradictions of the time, but it is a wake-up call to how you think about the world. And really, as a British subject, we had no idea about what was going on in terms of imperialism and colonialism. History Workshop Journal was the place. But people are still protesting. So we've got Greenham Common, I'm sure you know, the anti-nuclear protest. Totally represented as middle-class women. not seen to be a threat to the government. Margaret Thatcher calls them an eccentricity, but they still send the police in and they still criminalise them. So I think that was really good for kind of, again, another wake-up call. So I'm struggling. I'm at Birmingham in a seminar group, and there's another genius called Richard Johnson who wrote a book, well, edited a book called Making Histories. And this is his Marxist methodology that he takes from Marx. And I thought, oh, great, because there were no feminist methodology books at the time. I'll use this. And this is kind of the method that I always use now. So when you're studying everything, you appropriate the material, that's the research. You analyse its different forms of development, the historical, the social, the context. You look for the interconnections. Then you present it back and see if it actually works. And you go and talk to people, you validate it through ideas. Does it work as a theory? Does it work to explain what's going on? And so I kind of put all that together, but I also added in, and I think it really comes in number 4, the significance of representations. And Dorothy Smith, the famous Canadian Marxist feminist, was talking about textual mediation, how we only understand ourselves as gendered, or anything else actually, through textual mediations. We see the image and we understand who we are meant to be. So it's textual mediation, and that became really important. And so for me, from that, I generate these questions that some of you heard yesterday, so sorry, but what are the conditions of possibility and plausibility? What are the alternatives? I think that's a crucial question. Are there any alternatives? What needs to change? And so I'm looking at the ways of life of people and thinking, how is this happening? What's going on? And it was a mess. Anyway, and as I'm doing this, I get waylaid again. And this is the miners' strike. So important. In retrospect, we find out it was all planned. In retrospect, we found out there was spies in every trade union. In retrospect, we find out that they brought in Polish miners at the beginning. So there's a Ridley report, which was released under Freedom of Information by Seamus Mill, which he turned into a book called The Enemy Within, and it's called The Secret War Against the Miners. They were destroyed. We absolutely destroyed. It was the most violent strike. It had been planned. You can see the sense of the scale of it. Unbelievable militarisation. New trade laws introduced. You cannot move around the country. And I have a fear of horses ever since, because they rode horses at you. It's absolutely terrifying. And then you have the media. Rupert Murdoch's media. Look at that picture. So it's absolutely, everything is thrown. Every state apparati, repressive, ideological, all violent, thrown at the miners. So it's kind of about getting an education. It's not just an education about textually mediated femininity, it's an education about the power of images at this point in time. And exactly the same happened to Jeremy Corbyn. Somebody in the Sun put a Russian cap on him and said he was a communist spy. I mean, they just have the same script. They have the same book. So at this time, I begin to query Althusser through both gender perspective and almost the state perspective on ideology, because for Althusser, and I still don't know if I'm right, but for Althusser, he argues that people are interpolated. They recognise themselves in the image. And as a result of that, they fit into that position. And recognition is the key link in that process. So they recognise themselves. Does Arthur Scargill recognise himself as a fascist? No. Do working class white women recognise themselves as feminine? No, because they're told they're not all the time. So it's like, well, what's happening? What is the gap? And gaps are always great. Contradictions and gaps are the best thing about research. What is the gap between what's supposed to be happening and what is happening? The family, the big debate in feminism about the family. So Michelle Barrett, Mary McIntosh, fantastic research on the violence in the family, and quite rightly so. The majority of violence against women happens in the family. But a lot of black feminists came back and said, actually, and working class feminists, the family is a form of protection as well. And so there's this big debate going on. So is the family just a violent institution, gendered institution, or is it somewhere that protects people? And most of the white feminists at the time, including me, had an image of a heterosexual nuclear family, which is very different to the history of black families. Very, very different. You know, intergenerational, grandma's very significant. So we start being challenged through a lot of that, which is great. And I start taking on interpolation, because things like romance, and Rachel Harrison did a great study, the right man was always seen to be a very significant thing for ideologically interpolating women. But actually, through my research, as soon as the right man became unemployed, he quickly became the wrong man. So there was all sorts going on where the gaps were showing. Am I all right for time? Have I? Yeah, okay. And so there were great things happening, but critiques all the time. And so all the time we are challenging, what is the state? We always thought the welfare state existed to support people. Oh no. We always thought, or at least white people thought, the police was there to protect people. Oh no. And so we start learning that none of these things work. I invite an Irish speaker to York University where I'm working, and he gets held under the Anti-Terrorism Act for a week, which they can do because they've got rid of all the habeas corpus laws for incarceration. So, I mean, things are going on that are extraordinary. During the miners' strike, the mortgage companies began to play a really significant role by making the miners really impoverished. So not only were they starving, they were also having their mortgages withdrawn by banks and things like that. So we start seeing that all these different state and capital apparati are coming together. And I'm thinking, how do I incorporate this? Because my outside world is very different from my inside world, but I'm reading on both. And it always becomes a kind of question. So that was a miners' strike. Fortunately, the trade unions, the print unions, refused to print another version of the Arthur Scargill thing. The other thing that becomes really significant, and I become involved in, is the Miners' Wives campaign, and it's called Wives. But what happens as a result of this, the Miners' Wives start challenging all the theories around breadwinner, heterosexual family, and if you, do I put it up there? If you haven't seen it, see the film Pits and Perverts, because it is a really good representation of what was going on at the time. Heard it? Pits and Perverts. Oh no, Pride! Pride! I did a presentation with one of the women who was, you know, organising the Welsh stuff. I called it Pits and Perverts. It's called Pride, sorry. Well, that's what we were called. As we arrived in miners' villages with our buckets to collect money, you know, dressed up. Yes, it was kind of, okay. So then we get the Brighton bomb and we think, great. You'll be horrified by this, but most of us think, great, they've got the bastards. Because remember, they're killing the working class through starvation, through the miners' strike. They're actually starving people to death. And they have turned those villages, pit villages, well, they're not pit villages anymore, they're usually villages of heroin use, despair, early suicide rates, massive suicide rates. If you follow Durkheim and what that means. So, you know, I do not apologise for my desire to see a horrific government that is intent on killing people get blown up. But they don't. They don't. They just blow up the building, really. And sadly, they damage one of the wives of a really nasty MP, which is awful. But at the time, we have another heroine, Bernadette Devlin, a great feminist from Sinn Féin. So this is all working, the anti-apartheid movement's happening, and we have all the great people from there. Anne-Marie Walpy was just unbelievable, I think. All the films made by Joe Slovo's daughter, Gillian Slovo. But I'm still trying to think what really is going on. There's so much is going on. The state is really significant. And then we get Princess Diana. Every popular press puts Princess Diana everywhere. And we all get attacked for promoting homosexuality. So I had a research job, and that this was used in evidence that I was indoctrinating people. And I said, if only, but that didn't help. So there was a lot of attacking going on. If you taught anything slightly radical, the fascists would come for you. I was given a further education course of police cadets to teach. Oh, I mean, that was a dangerous thing to do because, you know, as you can imagine. Anyway, so there were key Marxist theorists now. They'd written really good books, Feminism and Marxism. There was a bit of conversation with it. But then along comes Foucault. And kind of everybody gets into Foucault in a big way, big fashion, big fashion. But really good for taking apart the heterosexual family. Really good. And so I'm adapting all the time. As I'm doing my research, I decide that ideology doesn't work through interpolation, it works through misrecognition. And now working class women are given an image of pathology. They are really, really seem to be bad. They're just going to have children, they're just going to breed. Eugenics is significant to all of this. They're a real problem, they're excessive. And the women don't recognise themselves as that. And they kind of campaign, but it's not really a political campaign. They campaign through themselves to be respectable. But not respectable in the historical middle class standards, a very different form, a superior form actually. They think, you know, they don't send their children to nurseries or something. They look after them properly. So properly becomes a really important word. But so I start working with the idea of misrecognition to explain the gap between the value that is attached to the representations or the discourse that is spoken of them and how they see themselves. I start looking at how ideology is working through different circuits. That comes from Richard Johnson as well. And I start looking at what are the possibilities of speech. And if you are only encoded in discourse as pathological, how do you respond? And so queer becomes really important. Resignification becomes really important. And then the women I'm working with in further education colleges do not want to be defined as class, because class comes with nasty baggage after all the Murdoch press of excessive breeders, you know, bringing down the standards of the nation, that kind of stuff. And so they say to me, no, we're not working class. A couple of them say they are. No. And I think, God, what's going on? How do I write this up if they're not going to use the words that sociologists would use? And so I start working with disidentification. And I would argue really, really strongly that class often works through disidentification rather than identification, because the power of the image, the semiotic power, actually encodes them with a low moral and cultural value. So they really challenge that to make it into something that gives them value in the local arena. So they defend, it's a defensive identity, it's not a positive identity. And so I look at dissimulation and I look at performance and think, yeah, that's what's happening. And then, of course, we get hit in a really big way by HIV. And HIV campaigns are, I was going to say virulent, but that's the word they use. Again, the Murdoch media just portrays everybody as a contagious and dangerous threat. So remember, at this time, we have young black men, very dangerous on the streets. Sorry, that's it, they're going to mug you. Black women, they're going to breed. White working class women, they're going to breed. And now we have people promoting homosexuality, but they're going to kill everybody because of danger and contagion. Now, have you seen It's a Sin? I'll call it by its right name. It's a Sin depicts that time period really, really well. I cried I never stop crying through it. It's just so awful, but really good. And what happens, and it was interesting you were saying you were organising an event like this, because what it does is kind of introduce people to the argument. We started working with lots of queer theory, and Don Cullick, lots of people, all these people kind of came, visited, spoke, organised a conference, brought everybody together, had a great reading group, and then I did a big research project on violence and space. But central to all this, I would argue, is we queered as a verb. It's not a noun, it's not an identity. It's queering everything, it's problematising everything, it's making it skew width. This was the kind of project that we ran, and then I realised how significant representations, narratives and discourses are, because Queer as Folk was being made at the same time as we were doing the research, and the scripts were almost identical. We could have used Queer as Folk obviously became much more snappy than you can write in an ESRC report, obviously. But it became really significant, so I started focusing on that. But we're still having bombing going on. This was when I just went, no more, no more. I got caught in them, they're horrible. But we're still protesting, so I will finish on time, I hope. We're still doing lots of protests. I was asked yesterday. I forgot to put in all the academic protests that we've had for, was it 2.5 years? Lots and lots of protests. There wasn't a great podcast you can see that the Tate did. It was a wonderful exhibition on women in revolt. Now, I just want to point out before I finish about institutional constraints, because when I was putting the archive together, I thought actually there's been not just political events informing what I do, but my job, where I work, what I do. So what I've always tried to do is create spaces for things like this, but they're being closed down, aren't they, Sarah? More and more and more and more and more. And what we're seeing increasingly is cramped spaces. We're being measured, we're being sacked in some cases. And anything, I think, that was really, really good they seem to be closing it down. So I write about this because I think institutional constraints and what we can do are really significant. A lot of us stopped working in rape crisis, domestic abuse. A lot of us stopped doing all those political activities that we used to do because we had to publish or we, would be in trouble. So I'm still trying to use both frames in everything I do, making history, but not in the conditions of what's choosing. And sometimes when you're stuck in all, you can imagine the maths that was my PhD. So what the hell's going on most of the time? I found a paper on subject positions, which is very Althusserian actually, because it means to be made subject and to develop a subjectivity. So subject positions are the positions you are put in by all the forces of the state, the economy, capital, the people around you, gender, and sexuality. And so I started thinking, back to overdetermination, which is a kind of Althusserian concept about what's informing these particular positions that people are inhabiting. And I looked at how people inhabiting things. So I can't explain everything. I tried to work with the theories for a particular project. I didn't think class was going to be as significant when we did the violence and sexuality project. Of course it was. And I said when I was doing the software project, I didn't think software was going to be about class or gender. Oh, of course it is. Everything is. So everything is articulated, as Stuart Hall would argue, and overdetermined. We should always study the conjuncture we're working in and the force, I would argue the forces that work through us. Some people talk about the forces that they inhabit and have and own. I think forces work through us, and I think we are a massive contradiction, and we are overdetermined. And that was, I found that was for you, for yesterday. The significance and the value that attaches to representations. I was trying to do how my books have explained different things, but you can find that. And then I came up with a lovely line from Gargi. I kind of messed this up a bit, Gargi Bhattacharya. I now think I'm querying how the political economy of racial capitalism is lived in the present conjuncture. So that's what I think I'm doing now, at least I'm trying to do. And now I'm working on necropolitics, the killing of people. And I put that up at the last because my beautiful friend Lisa Blackman and myself have just gone through a kind of particular experience of living all these overdeterminations. And this is a queer political economy of racial capitalism written by S. Lachlan Jane that completely describes the political economy of cancer and food, really, and food. So that's it. It was all a struggle. I hopefully can give up. I doubt if I ever will. I can't go on marches anymore. I can't walk properly. But hopefully I'll end on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bev. That was really great, and I kind of I could connect with and kind of recognize in my own path many of the same things in a way. So I thought it was very interesting that you kind of told this in this specific sort of format. So what's going to happen now is Minna Seikkula is gonna present a few comments. Bev can answer, and after that we're gonna have audience discussion. I should say. When we were kind of planning this with talking about this with Minna, she was like, "You don't have to tell them anything about me other than she's not just some weird person who comes and talks for no reason. So now she has official permission to present her thoughts on this."
Okay. Thank you, Sami, for legitimizing my presence here, and thank you. Bev, what a joy and privilege to be the first person to start at this abundant buffet of very inspiring, interesting thinking. I try, because I'm sure, we have a packed room. I'm sure the room is also packed with all kind of questions and comments. So I try to be concise. I thought I'll highlight let's say 3 discussion points. And first, one of them concerns the state and austerity measures. And I think it's very apt for those of us who live in Finland. The 1980s Britain seems very relatable. And currently we have a Minister of Finance who seems to embrace the comparison between her and Margaret Thatcher. She poses with sisters in media when she tells about austerity measures. It's actually I don't even have words what that is. And obviously it's a part of multi-party government who are responsible for austerity measures like never before. So it's very tempting to
I'm trying to turn this off.
Maybe distract you. But maybe we can have it. Yeah. That's it.
Just leave it, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway.
Sorry,
no worries. Yeah, well, anyway, it's very tempting, I think, for many of us to seek these parallels, and also just for everyone, something I'm very much looking forward to, that someone would pick up policing the crisis and apply that methodology to the discussion on youth we have currently in Finland. So please, someone do it. But however, I'm also a person who actually has very much internalized the critique you briefly mentioned on the welfare state also as a repressive apparatus. So I think you mentioned it here and there, but I wonder, is it really so that, or if you want to comment on the paradoxical role of the state, that on the other hand, I'm sure all of us are trying to contest the austerity measures by, in a way, defending the state. But does this critique of the state as a repressive apparatus still? I think you kind of said that you would want the welfare state back anyway, any day. But still, does it mean that critique doesn't have any role? So I'd be curious to hear about that. Then to my second discussion point that has to do with recognition, misrecognition, and disidentification. And kind of as a background, while listening to you, I was any of you who know Bev's work, you know her definition and position on class, and the emphasis how that's not an identity, and how class relations are a place of antagonism, and so forth. And I think there were like many very inspiring points about relating to identity. You were saying on the one hand, like how we in the academia, what kind of discussions we have, the question of representation, where I think the politics of representation is on the one hand very, very crucial and important, and we should think how universities continue to be places of white privilege and maybe even white supremacy, but then at the same time the boundaries we create when we, I think you were on to the discussions, was it 80s or 90s, like who gets to do research on what, and that can be very, I think there can be something like very counterproductive in that, while I also think that the white supremacy is something we should do something about. And then thinking of the disidentification, like through the work I've done in Finland through the category of immigrant, maahanmuuttaja, and that's actually something that no one wants to be, but that's also, immigrants are the ones who are disciplined and who gets to do all kinds of courses, endless amount of courses, and who are the so-called unskilled, who are categorized as unskilled labor. So so kind of this is not so concise as the previous point, but kind of overhearing these thoughts and wanting to ask you, when we live, like I think we live in like again a heightened time of identity politics, and kind of what's your take on that, and what can we make of it? Like what I sometimes myself think is this Karen F. Fields and Barbara J. Fields quote that the object was never to produce white supremacy, but cotton and sugar. So and then finally on
what was that sentence, end of your sentence?
Pardon?
It was never to produce something, and you said
it was never to produce white supremacy, but to produce cheap cotton and sugar. They probably have tobacco too, so just quoting from my memory. And then finally, like on gender and feminism, and it's so brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your journey as a thinker, and like it's to put Marxism and feminism together. It's not easy, and you are one of the people who've shown how that can be done. And I think it's still like what we learn from your work among the others, how when talking about caring and social reproduction, things get messy. I was recently reading a novel, or actually listening to an audiobook, which is kind of stigmatized. So listening an audiobook by Luc Bardugo, and it's a fiction novel, but I love this sentence, or two sentences. The purest Marxists are always men. Calamity comes too easily to women. Our lives can come apart in a single gesture, a rogue wave. So while I really think that that's how it is, and I'm also asking as a person whose next research project is going to be on politics of abortion, but still when I'm looking at this Marxist feminist discussion on social production, I can't, because I'm also trained in academic feminism in the Judith Butler way. That was my academic education. So I cannot look away from the very binary conception of gender that I'm not saying not all Marxist feminists, but I think it's very much there. And then I'm thinking also not to do this categorization exercise on anyone's gender, but more to ask your views on queering as a verb. Like, what's the relevance of queering to think of social reproduction? Yeah, so these were my 3 talking points. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just writing that down. Thank you very, very much. Great points. As I said yesterday, you come to Finland to have the hard questions, and you never don't get them, actually. So thank you, Minna. It's horrible that you're also going through the Thatcherism celebration. I think what's really difficult about it is we did all those critiques, which were about the violence of the state mainly, the racism of the state, the heterosexuality of the state, and the way it really punishes working class women of whatever kind. But when your alternative is corporate hedge funds, BlackRock, Blackstone, owning most of the state, you'll take all that back. I mean, you've got the critique in a way, you know what's wrong with it, but you still need people to be fed and warm and not breathe in mould. So I think what's happened is we have, I don't know, Sarah may not agree with me, but I feel we've been pushed back so far. You know, that we did a conference, actually, interestingly, it was about 10 years ago at Goldsmiths. And I remember Tracy Jensen saying, I never thought I'd say I welcome the state. You know, because she's done lots of work on mothering and social reproduction in the state. And I thought, yeah, it's right. Because, first of all, we never knew that everything was being sold off to Brett Christophers. We never knew his first book, Enclosures, was the beginning of the privatisation of public land like school playing fields, school swimming pools, education, really, and health. And then his... the rentier capitalism is really about asset managers. No, Our Lives in Their, that's the second one that builds on the rentiers, and then Our Lives in Their Portfolios, which is a frightening book because I thought we knew what was happening to the welfare state. I thought the state was selling it off to PF, you know, like private funding initiatives. But the fact that asset managers come in and just want to, they are sold whole housing estates for minimum amount of money. And they just wreck them even further because they just want to load them with debt more than anything, load them with more money. So we did have a repressive welfare state. We knew how it repressed people. We've got so many critiques of it. I think if we could only have it back, we could make it work better. But, you know, the political chances of that are very hard. And all this has happened through stealth. I mean, this is the big problem with it. It gets sold off and you have no idea. We know about some, we know about the rail networks, but things like parts of the energy industry, we don't know anything about. We suddenly find out, you know, after God knows how many people were poisoned with water in Devon, we suddenly find out that it's all been sold off to a Chinese company. You know, it's like, what the hell? So, for me now, my analysis of the state would be I'd love the welfare state back, whatever, because people need. It can't be any worse. But that means we've been really pushed back. So I'd say defend at this moment and find out what the hell's going on. Now, Brett Christophers is in Uppsala, so he may have a better perspective on Sweden than I would, or Finland. So defend it. So, yes, there is a problem, and it is paradoxical. I don't want the racist state. I don't want the militarised state, but, you know, at least people were fed and housed and children weren't starving. We've got 40% of child poverty, 40% of children in child poverty. You know, that is not a good statistic. It's horrific. It's at 40 or 47. I mean, it's a huge number. So yes, that's that one. And I won't go on and on and on. It is repressive, yeah. Class, really complex one, because I think it's not an identity. I'd argue very strongly it is not an identity. It is a position. It is a structural position. It is a subject position. And I think we need it. I wouldn't ever abandon it. I think we need it so people understand their structural conditions. And they may not want to be called class, but as long as they realise the class relationships that they inhabit. I'd love it to be back as a